Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The World's Last Night. This is James Thayer. Today we're in Exodus chapter 21, and I have to tell you, I'm not really looking forward to the next several chapters and even books, not going to lie. Leviticus has some interesting stuff in it. But honestly, okay, I'm going to be very honest with you. I might skip Leviticus and Numbers and go straight to, heck, I might skip Deuteronomy. And that's probably sad because that's the most quoted book in the New Testament by Jesus. Like, he's always quoting Deuteronomy. But I would be real excited to go through Judges, which is the next one after Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And, oh, wait a minute. No, it's not. Oh, is it Joshua? Oh, Joshua's awesome. All right, maybe we go through Joshua. Anyway, we're about to get into the law. And it's the Mosaic law, so this is the laws that Moses institutes. And it's divinely inspired. We do find out in the New Testament by Jesus that Moses often gave laws that were concessions to humanity because of, and I quote, the hardness of our hearts. So, for example, Moses allowed for divorce. Jesus in the New Testament says, well, he only gave that to you because you're a bunch of sinful people, you have hard hearts, and it's a concession for your life. But that's not how it was supposed to be from the beginning. From the beginning, you know, God made man and woman, intended them to be married forever, you know, for this life anyways, until death. So I feel like there are several things Moses wrote that doesn't necessarily line up with an ideal. They all, not all of them, but a lot of them seem to be concessions because we're a sinful, manipulative people. We're like children, you know, and sometimes you just can't tell a child and expect them to do X, Y, and Z because you know that they're children. And you know if they're put in that situation that they're going to maybe screw it up. I don't know. My point is, we're about to get into a lot of specific laws. And if you're not a judge or a lawyer or a legislator, you might not care about this. If you are any of those people, these chapters actually might be extremely interesting to you because you're seeing the framework of a legal system to deal with both civil and criminal issues. It reads like a law book, and I will say it's pretty decently set apart from other cultures at the time. A lot of the things in here, you're going to go, ugh, to. But that's only because you don't think about it through the lens of what was going on in the surrounding peoples in their communities of Israel. So those things that you go, ugh, to are actually extremely, quote-unquote, progressive based on the laws that were in force in Israel prior when they lived in Egypt and the surrounding people, such as the Canaanites and the Egyptians and all of that. And it's interesting that the first thing that we talk about here is laws about slaves because, well, God just pulled all these people out of slavery. And this is where we immediately get to this point where people in our modern society, they just don't care to read. They don't care to compare. They don't care to see what the differences might be. But this slavery that's mentioned here is more like indentured servitude and far less like what you and I consider slavery from when we think about the transatlantic slave trade or the Arab slave trade or what we see in movies or mistreated POWs, etc., etc. And it's not to say that injustices like that did not occur in the Israelite system. It's to say that the laws that Moses gives for slavery are to restrict slavery from its unfeathered state that the surrounding peoples have It's to basically say, these are the restrictions that I'm going to put on this terrible institution to separate you from the surrounding peoples. So let me just start by giving you a simple example. Modern day thoughts on slavery, you think about, say, the Arab slave trade. You were talking about people who would kidnap North Africans, kidnap Europeans. They would typically put all the females that they kidnapped into sex slavery, and any males, which were hardly any, they would castrate and have them be eunuchs and put them into servitude. Now, that is not the same as what we're talking about here, because here in Israel, you could not become a slave through those means, through kidnapping. In fact, we're going to read that is banned. But in Israel, there were 4 ways that you could become a Hebrew slave. So that would be, one way is you're in extreme poverty, and so you might sell your liberty to someone in order to get out of that. So you might know someone who's wealthy, and you say, "Hey, I'll be your indentured servant if you take care of me." Now you're going to find out the length of time that you could be a slave if you were a Hebrew is 6 years. By the 7th year, that you have to be emancipated. So if you're in extreme poverty, this might be an option for you to sell yourself into slavery or indentured servitude for 6 years to serve someone who takes care of you, and it's a contractual relationship. Another thing is a father might sell a daughter as a servant into a house, and the intention is that she's supposed to marry someone in that family, and there would be a contract for that too. So women were for the most part dependent upon either their father or their husband to take care of them. And so the idea is, if you're a woman, you want to get married. And so a father might sell his daughter to another family, and part of that contract is that other family has to integrate that daughter into their family through marriage. And so they have to take care of her and give her a husband. And you're going to find out what happens whenever they fail to do that. Another way you might become a slave if you're in Israel is if you go into bankruptcy. You can become a servant to your creditors. Now, we don't have debtors' jails or anything like that because we realize that if you put someone who's in debt in jail who's not paying their debts, well, they're never going to pay it because they're in jail. Well, this is actually an okay workaround for that, in that the person could become a slave of the person they are in debt to, literally, not just figuratively, and work to pay off that debt. So that's another way you could become a slave. The final way you can become a slave is if you're a thief, you steal, maybe you squander it, and you have no way to pay back the person that you stole from. Well, you might become a slave who has to pay back what you stole through working it off through labor. So notice these are all legal transactions. They're not necessarily slaves from war. Well, you wouldn't go to war with your own kinsmen because these are just rules for Hebrew slaves. And they're not, you can't kidnap someone. And as they're going to find out, you're limited on the time that you can be there. So these are actually limitations placed upon an institution that everyone pretty much hates. But what we're going to find is this is a step in the right direction. Okay, so here we go. Verse 1. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he is to serve for 6 years. Then in the 7th, he is to leave as a free man without paying anything. If he arrives alone, he is to leave alone. If he arrives with a wife, his wife is to leave with him. Okay, then there's this little verse 4. But if his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children belong to her master, and the man must leave alone. So here's an example of that. There's another indentured servant, a female. This other guy then becomes an indentured servant, or vice versa. The guy becomes first, then the lady later, and this guy's about to end his term as a servant. And so year 6 ends, and now he's a free man, but he married another female slave in year 4. And so her term is not up. And as such, she still has a contract and an obligation to her master, and so he's not allowed to leave with her. She has to finish working off her debt. So there you go. I think it sucks, like separating a family. And you would hopefully be able to work some deal out if you were that guy, where you could still like work on the family farm and maybe make a wage or whatever. I don't know. But this is what we're at. Okay. Here we go. Number 5. But if the slave declares, I love my master, my wife, and my children. I don't want to leave as a free man. His master is to bring him to the judges, and then bring him to the door or doorposts. His master must pierce his ear with an awl, and he will serve his master for life. I don't like these two extremes. One, hey, you can go free after 6 years, or B, you can be a slave forever. I think it would be cool if you could just re-up your indentured servitude until your wife is able to go free also. That's just me. But it does offer a way for this guy to be able to work out a deal with his former master. And it's all done in front of the public, this whole piercing of the ear and all of that. When it says to bring him to the judges. So apparently there's some judges in Israel that sort of make sure this is a good deal and no one's being abused. Maybe, I would hope, they would explore that this guy's not being coerced by his former master. Okay, verse 7. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she is not to leave as the male slaves do. Dum, dum, dum. If she is displeasing to her master, who chose her for himself, then he must let her be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to foreigners because he has acted treacherously towards her. Okay, let me explain this to you. This is, remember, you could sell your daughter to someone. Now, the expectation is this daughter is to be married into that family. So she doesn't leave because she's supposed to contractually become a wife. This is actually, it sounds bad. Oh, she can't leave like the male slaves can. Okay, but the contract is different. This contract is she is required, or you are required to give her one of your sons to be her husband, to take care of her. And that is why it says, if she's displeasing to her master who chose her for himself. So he just changes his mind. He's like, I don't like the way she cooks or whatever, right? Who knows? Who knows how they thought this stuff through? She's displeasing though. Maybe she's actually a jerk. Or maybe he found another girl for his son or whatever. He must let her be redeemed. Okay, so she has to be redeemed. He has no right to sell her to a foreigner because he has acted treacherously towards her. In other words, he broke the contract. She was supposed to be able to get married, and he broke the contract. So she can be redeemed, and what I believe that is that she gets money, something out of this deal because she's been I was gonna say screwed. I don't know what the biblical term would be, but she was acted treacherously towards and was lied to. Okay, or if he chooses her for his son, okay, that's what she wanted, he must deal with her accordingly to the customary treatment of daughters. Okay, so if he chooses her for his son to be married, which is what the expectation was whenever she joined this family, right, then she's supposed to be treated as a daughter. So he, again, has to take care of her. And the son, the husband, has to take care of her also. And then we're going to get into polygamy, team. Who knows? Who knows why? If he takes an additional wife, he must not reduce the food, clothing, or marital rights of the first wife. And if he does not do these 3 things for her, she may leave free of charge without any exchange of money. Okay. A, don't take an additional wife. B, this is actually, again, it's 2 ways to look at this. One, you can say, oh man, you mean the Bible might have polygamy? Trust me, anytime polygamy is mentioned in the Bible, it's because it is something that I guess men in particular are prone towards because of sexual deviancy. But it always costs more than it's worth for anyone in the Bible, as we found out with previously men having multiple wives and issues between that. Well, in this, it basically says, hey, if you're going to do that, you cannot start treating your original wife any worse or any less. Like, she still is due all the same. And this food, I heard, is translated into like meat, but it's supposed to mean like delicacies. She still has a right to that, to the clothing, and to the any marital right of a wife, which would also include sex, right? She has a right to that. And the best is if he doesn't do these, then she can leave anytime she wants without, paying any money or anything, free of charge. Because once again, he did her wrong. So I hate all of this. I hate going through this because unless you like really think hard about it, your gut reaction is ugh. And then you really think hard about it, and you're like, okay, that's a good concession, I guess. This is actually restricting the ugh. But then you go, oh man, but now I know Jesus and I know what God really intended, and the concessions aren't good enough for me. Like, I want an even better society than that. And so then you go, so what's the point of all this? Well, for me, it just sort of shows where we've grown from, and I'm very thankful for Jesus. So I read it in that light. I don't read these laws to glean exactly how I should live my life, other than maybe from this you should say you need to treat people, even those you have an advantage over, very well. Okay, laws about personal injury, verse 12. Whoever strikes a person so that he dies must be put to death. Okay, capital punishment, that's normal. That was already instituted by God previously. But if he didn't intend any harm, and yet God caused it to happen by his hand, I will appoint a place for you where he may flee. Okay, now this is manslaughter. So if you're the lawyer type or the judge type, you might be like, oh, this is kind of interesting, because their law differentiated between murder and manslaughter. It was an accident, but the person died anyways. Well, they should be punished. But it says here that there's going to be a place appointed him for to flee. Now later you find out these are cities. There's certain sanctuary cities that you could flee to. Let me read a little more, then I'll explain that. If a person willfully acts against his neighbor to murder him by scheming, you must take him from my altar to be put to death. Okay, two things. There's a differentiation between murder, scheming. It's an intent, right? I intended to kill this person whenever I struck him. And then the other one is manslaughter. Maybe we were wrestling, and I hit him. He hit his head and died, and we didn't mean that. I didn't mean that to happen. Well, the intent actually matters in our current legal system, and it matters in this legal system. And so in the Old Testament, you had sanctuary cities where if there was manslaughter, you could flee to, and basically you would have protection there until judges could judge your case to see if you were guilty or not of the crime that you would deserve punishment for. That's what that whole I will appoint a place where you may flee to. But then this last part's kind of interesting, where it said, hey, if they schemed and murdered their neighbor, you take them from my altar and put them to death. In other words, you could hold on to the horns of the altar, God's altar. And a lot of times, like I just said, sanctuary cities, sanctuary churches, sanctuary altars, whatever, people would do that. And they would basically, you can't kill me here in this holy spot, and I get sanctuary here so I get away from the punishment. Well, God's like, no. Rip that guy off my altar and go and put him to death. Like, he's not going to find sanctuary in here if he murdered someone willfully. Okay, we'll keep going. Verse 15, exciting stuff. Whoever strikes his father or his mother must be put to death. Now, again, this is talking about strikes them and kills them. So that makes sense. Whoever kidnaps a person must be put to death, whether he sells him or the person is found in his possession. So this is actually a law against slavery in the sense that you and I know about. So, the Atlantic slave trade, you had African tribes, went to war against other African tribes. They enslaved the warriors. Then Americans, a lot of people, but Americans would sail over to Africa, buy these slaves from those tribes, take them back, make them slaves, whatever. That is not slavery in the Israelite sense. That is actually right here banned. Whoever kidnaps a person must be put to death, whether he sells him, slavery, or the person is found in his possession. So you're not going to be able to get away from it. If you have the person and you've kidnapped them, or if you've already sold them off, you still are to be put to death. And this is reflected in the New Testament, where Paul basically says that slavers are going to hell. Kidnappers, human kidnappers, are going to hell. So the Bible is actually explicitly against what you and I would consider slavery. It seems to be okay with certain human ideas around indentured servitude. I think that's the greatest thing you could levy against it when it comes to that. But again, you and I are like, employment just sounds better than this system. Let's do a right to work state. Anywho, whoever curses his father or his mother must be put to death. That's pretty hardcore. The translation of curses there would be threaten the life of. So whoever threatens the life of his father or his mother must be put to death. And of course, you would have judges and stuff to deal with this. Explicitly elsewhere, you'll read that the father and the mother are not allowed to do this themselves. They can't be the ones to put the kid to death. Someone else has to, after a trial of some sort. Verse 18, when men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or fist, and the injured man does not die, but is confined to bed, if he can later get up and walk around outside leaning on his staff, then the one who struck him will be exempt from punishment. Nevertheless, he must pay for his lost work time and provide for his complete recovery. People are quarreling. They're angry at each other. One's injured, confined to a bed, so broke a leg or something. It basically says, well, he didn't die, so they're not to be punished. However, then it says he must pay for his lost work time and provide for his complete recovery. He has to basically pay workers' compensation and pay all the medical bills. Again, if you're a lawyer or a judge or whatever, this is probably extremely interesting to you. Otherwise, it's just like, oh man, I don't like reading all this kind of stuff. But it is sort of interesting that, again, these are restrictions on conduct and, talking about civil penalties. That's pretty cool, I guess. When a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies under his abuse, the owner must be punished. Interesting. Owner, talking about owning people, that sucks. But that is what I guess indentured servitude is. Number 2, this is to say basically, hey, if you are going to have servants, you can't kill them. Like, that's not legal. And there's several cultures where that's fine because they're like, well, they're my property, so I'm going to kill them. This is basically saying, well, yeah, they're your property in a sense because you've paid for them. Like, you take care of them in exchange for their labor, and like you're going to be out money if they go away. But it also says you need to like take care of them. Like, you don't, just because they're technically some form of property, they're not, that doesn't mean that they don't have a right to life. That doesn't mean they're not humans, they're not people. And that's a huge difference between this version and like what you'd consider in the American states, the slavery that we had, which was detestable and stripped the humanity of the slaves. So, okay. However, if the slave can stand up after a day or two, the owner should not be punished because he is his owner's property. So apparently there's a difference between striking and killing and striking and just injuring really badly. New Testament is interesting because in the New Testament it ups the ante on this. And slavery in the same sense as this, like an indentured servant, basically ups the ante and says you're not supposed to treat them harshly at all, which would include like how you speak to them. We can talk about that later. You get a whole episode on slavery, and I through apologetics would show you how scripturally slavery is not right. And also the evolution of the thought on it comes from Scripture as to how we eventually abolished it. William Wilberforce is sort of credited with abolishing slavery in the United Kingdom, and he was an ardent Christian that argued against slavery from Scripture and against many of the prevailing churches of the time, calling them out on their hypocrisy for indulging in slavery. And slavery was ended in the UK without any civil war because people listened to Christians like William Wilberforce. Definitely a man who deserves a lot of recognition, the way he dealt with that institution of evil. All right, when men get in a fight and hit a pregnant woman so that her children are born prematurely, but there is no injury, the one who hit her must be fined, as a woman's husband demands from him, and he must pay according to judicial assessment. Sounds like the baby was delivered okay, just prematurely, if there's no injury. Okay, if there is an injury, then you must give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, bruise for bruise, wound for wound. You're going to see that kind of language in the Old Testament pretty decent frequently. It's used incorrectly nowadays. Nowadays, you hear people like, vengeance, life for life, tooth for tooth. Well, in the Old Testament, this is actually a limiting language. It is, hey, so they knocked your tooth out. You're not allowed to kill them. You can just take their tooth. Like, it's actually limiting what people can or cannot ask in recompense. Now, in our modern day court system, it's kind of bad in a sense. I think people would argue with me on that. But it is kind of bad in a sense that you're allowed to sue someone for more money than the damages they caused you. And so you can actually, as a jury, give punitive damages as a way to just, it's sort of retribution. Well, the Bible here is saying, no, you really can't do that. You can only exact what was taken from you. Okay, when a man strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys it, he must let the slave go free in compensation for his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his male or female slave, he must let the slave go free in compensation for his tooth. Basically, it's saying, even if... Well, this is funny because verse 29 was like, hey, if they can stand up, they should not be punished because it's owner's property. Apparently, though, there's a difference between being able to stand up and having pieces of you knocked off. But it's really just telling, slave owners that, hey, you need to treat your slaves well, because if you destroy a piece of their body, they get to go free and you lose without any compensation all of your investment, and the contract is null and void. And so they get their freedom. Again, this is restricting language, but again, it's like, you didn't go far enough. I don't feel like you went far enough. But these people are probably pretty satisfied with it after living under Egyptian slavery. Okay, verse 28. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox must be stoned, and its meat may not be eaten, but the ox's owner is innocent. So, this is sort of like when a neighbor's dog bites you. And when I was little, a neighbor's dog did bite me. Bit my kneecap off. What a jerk. Well, they put that dog to death. They took him away and put him down. You don't want an animal to continue to live that has injured a human. Their lives are not even worth the injury of a human. And like in my old neighborhood, one of my friends actually got bit by a dog at the dog park, and I don't know why, but the lady would just like apologized or whatever, and they didn't put the dog down. It's like, well, the dog is gonna bite again. Anyways. Put your animals down if they bite people. That's all I'm saying. Okay. And Scripture, Old Testament would agree with that. Okay. What am I doing here? If he knocks... Okay, nope. However, if the ox was in the habit of goring, and its owner has been warned, yet does not restrain it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox must be stoned, and its owner must also be put to death. See, this is like that woman who did not put her dog down that bit my neighbor. I totally think, well, if that dog goes and bites someone else, you should personally be liable because you're being an idiot and not killing your dog. Okay, anyways. You can tell I have a lot less compassion for animals than a lot of people. I love animals. I think they're beautiful, but the moment they hurt my child, I'm going to kill it. If instead a ransom is demanded of him, he can pay a redemption price for his life in full amount demanded from him. So instead of the owner being put to death, they can pay a civil penalty in money. If it gores a son or a daughter, he is to be dealt with according to the same law. So children were protected just as well as adults. If the ox gores a male or female slave, he must give 30 shekels of silver to the slave's master, and the ox must be stoned. So the slaves actually not as valuable, which I also think is wrong. But they deal with it in terms of money very frequently. So the owner of that slave, the average price for a slave was 30 shekels of silver, which, interestingly enough, is what Judas received for betraying Jesus. But in any case, they're not put to death. I wonder if it counts as both. I wonder if they are put to death. If this kills a man or woman, okay. Dum dum dum. I'm going to say this is both. Because if you really take this literally, which it's a legal thing, it would say if it's a slave, this is how I think it really puts it out. The slave dies because an ox gores him. All the former rules apply of the person's life is not in jeopardy unless the ox had been in habit of it, or animal had been in habit of it. But the animal must be killed, and in addition to all of this, all the previous punishments, if it's a slave that dies, then you also owe the slave owner the money that they spent on the slave, the 30 shekels. That makes more sense to me. Okay, verse 33, and guys, we're very close to done. When a man uncovers a pit or digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit must give compensation. He must pay money to its owner, but the dead animal will become his. So it could be a trap. It could be they dug it for, I don't know, holding grain. Well, I don't think you want to put grain on the ground. Water, whatever, a well. Sounds like you owe the owner the money for the animal, but then you get to keep the dead animal. You get to eat it is the thing there. That it can become food. When a man's ox injures his neighbor's ox and it dies, they must sell the live ox and divide its proceeds. They must also divide the dead animal. So you each get half to eat, and you each get half of the proceeds of the live ox. And then neither of you get to keep a full ox. That seems totally just. That seems like the best gentleman's agreement you could make. If, however, it is known that the ox was in the habit of goring, yet its owner has not restrained it, he must compensate fully ox for ox. The dead animal will become his. Also makes sense. So this, again, if you're the lawyer type, this is negligence, right? You're talking about specific laws for negligence. So that's the end of chapter 21. It's pretty interesting. It can be. At the same time, you're just you read it and you're frustrated because you're this doesn't necessarily apply, even though I can find certain principles of justice in here, such as what do you do in cases of negligence, in cases of manslaughter, in cases of murder. And guess what? Chapter 22, we get to talking about thefts. And then we talk about protecting crops and personal properties, capital offenses, protecting the vulnerable, respecting God, laws about honesty and justice, festivals, Sabbath, all that stuff. Just laws. Laws. It's not my favorite. Oh my goodness. So that's why, team, I might skip a lot of this. Not gonna lie. But I will stick with it for a little bit longer because once we do a little bit of it, then I feel comfortable that if you're reading Leviticus or Numbers or whatever on your own, then you're going to be okay, I can apply the same principles that we applied in Exodus, because I think that's the important part is look at these legal things through the lens of the day and the culture, its context, right? So we'll jump into laws about theft whenever I return. But until then, this is James from The World's Last Night.